Welcome to 10 Minute Record Views, episode 159. And this time I'm going to talk about Rage Against the Machine's debut album from 1992 on Epic, Rage Against the Machine. And what I've got here is a 2015 reissue on Sony's Legacy series, which, yeah, is a reissue, but it sounds absolutely amazing. Dead quiet vinyl, wonderful soundstage. What kind of music is this? Well, if you've been living on Mars, you may not know this is basically a mix of punk, rap, and metal. It's got two very clear influences that I can hear, one of which is Public Enemy on the rap side, and the other is Black Sabbath. It's an almost seamless blend of those two styles, but there's also a lot of punk influence. Most of the band members were involved in various punk acts over the years, and Zach De La Rocha, the singer, has a very clear style, which is all his own. In terms of style too, while owing a heavy debt to those influences I've mentioned, this band are distinctive in how tight they are, particularly the rhythm section, wound tight like a spring. And Rage are, of course, one of the most political and radical of bands. They're politically literate, they're given to critical thinking, they're very effective at getting their message across lyrically, even if sometimes they do dabble a little bit in conspiracy thinking. But overall, their more revolutionary, radical stance is not surprising, because this is a band which has revolution in the blood. It's not really possible to understand Rage Against the Machine without understanding, I think, the background and history of the different players in the band. Zach De La Rocha was born in Long Beach in 1970. His dad was a Mexican-American artist and really quite a radical in his own way. He was part of Los Four, which was the first Mexican-American art collective or group of artists of any kind to get any kind of public exhibition happening in Los Angeles, and he does so in 1973. His dad, Zach's grandfather, was an actual revolutionary who fought in the Mexican Revolution. Zach grew up inland in California, in Irvine, a city he calls one of the most racist cities imaginable. Unsurprisingly, he rebelled against the conservative nature of that town, and he grows up a big punk fan. He finds a kindred spirit in elementary school early on when he meets Timmy C, or Tim Comerford, who, of course, is the bass player for Rage Against the Machine. They end up forming a band in high school called Juvenile Expression, which plays together for a little while and then breaks apart, but that connection would be important later on. Later on in the 1980s, Zach continues in punk and he joins a band called Hard Stance, moving from guitar, which he'd played in Juvenile Expression, to vocals. With that change, the band brought in a new guitarist and they'd renamed themselves Inside Out. Again, still a punk band, but one heavily influenced by Bad Brains. Tim Comerford himself was a native of Irvine, California. He'd grown up in what sounds, by all accounts, to have been a pretty shitty family situation. His parents' marriage was not particularly happy. Fairly early on, his mom was diagnosed with cancer. She moves to Sacramento to get treatment. He lives with his dad. That relationship, according to Tim, was a pretty abusive one, and the only real escape he had from his shitty home circumstance was through music. Zach, at this point, had introduced him to the bass, and for a while they'd played together in that band, Juvenile Expression. The guitarist for Rage, Tom Morello, was born in 1964 in Harlem. Tom's dad's side, the Kenyan side, is pretty much Kenyan political royalty. His dad had been in the Mau Mau uprising against the British. After independence, he was the first UN ambassador from Kenya to the United Nations. Beyond that, his great uncle was Jomo Kenyatta, the very first elected leader of Kenya after independence. Sadly for Tom, his parents' marriage doesn't last very long. His dad goes back to Kenya and he ends up being raised by his mom in Libertyville, Illinois. His own radical politics, which he came by honestly, of course, were evident from an early age. And he goes off to Harvard, he gets a political science degree in Harvard, and then he heads off to California. Living in LA before he gets his music career going, he has a pretty interesting CV, and that includes working as a male exotic dancer and also working for Senator Alan Cranston, which was, in his mind, a hugely disillusioning experience because, as he says, the senator was basically on the phone 80% of the time just asking for money for rich people, and that, he felt, was just emblematic of everything that was wrong with American politics. So he bails out of that and gets into music. In the mid-80s, he starts playing guitar seriously. He's in a band called Electric Sheep with one of the future members of Tool, Adam Jones, as a bassist. The music and lyrics that he writes, unsurprisingly, is very political. He's heavily influenced by Run DMC, Public Enemy, and other contemporary hip-hoppers, but he's also a huge metal fan. Later in the 80s, he's in a band called Lock Up, which puts out one album called Something Bitchin' This Way Comes, which I think is the best 80s album title ever. Anyway, while he's in Lock Up, he comes across Brad Wilk, who auditioned unsuccessfully for the drum chair when their drummer at the time had left. Wilk himself was from Portland. He'd grown up in Chicago and then ended up in Southern California as a young man. And he hadn't succeeded during the audition for Lock Up, but he had made an impression on Morello, who, when Lock Up then broke up shortly thereafter, contacts Wilk and says, "Hey, do you want to form a band?" At this point, Zach is still with Inside Out, but they don't have much longer to run. They break up in the early part of 1991. He then embraces hip-hop. Morello comes to one of those gigs, loves his sound, loves the content of his lyrics, approaches him afterwards and said, "Look, we have to get together. We're basically on the same page." Zach agrees. They've already got a drummer because Wilk is already on board. And so Zach reaches out to Tim Comerford, his old friend from Juvenile Expression, and brings him in on bass. They get writing straight away, and the chemistry is instant. They make themselves a demo tape. They self-publish it and self-distribute it through their fan club. They sell 5,000 copies of it, and they get signed to Epic Records. This album is nominally produced by Garth Richardson, but there's a ton of input by the musicians themselves because Rage had been given a large amount of creative control when they signed with Epic. The cover, of course, famously shows Thich Quang Duc, the Buddhist monk, burning himself alive in a protest in South Vietnam in Saigon in 1963, a protest against the Diem regime, which was supported by the Americans. It represents the Catholic minority in the country, which basically controlled all the land, controlled the military, controlled the government, and soaked up much of the foreign aid which the Americans were bringing. And there were lots of protests by the Buddhist majority. These were dealt with harshly, often violently. There was indiscriminate killing of protesters. And Quang Duc's protest is basically the turning point in bringing huge international attention to the situation in South Vietnam. A guy called Malcolm Brown took this photograph, ends up on the front page of newspapers all over the world. And in the words of the New York Times reporter who witnessed the event, as he burned, he never moved a muscle, never uttered a sound. His outward composure in sharp contrast to the wailing people around him. Whatever you think of the ethics of reproducing this picture in the cover of a record, it's an incredibly moving story. Side one starts with Bomb Track, and right away it's like nothing you've ever heard before. It's basically Sabbath meets hip hop, and if anything, it's heavy on the Sabbath, light on the hip hop. I say that because the philosophy of the songwriting is very much that the killer riff defines and drives everything, and that's really, really true. And it's also true that, like Sabbath, these songs are littered with riffs. There's never just one, there's always several which amplify the whole tune. On top of all that is a healthy dose of anti-capitalist lyrics, and so their credentials are pretty much clear right from the get-go. The second song, of course, is that track, the one which really defines them early on and maybe still today, Killing in the Name. And I have to say, this is one of those songs where I can remember exactly where I was, which is in my friends Karsten and Rebecca's house in Ottawa, listening to this song for the very first time, having my jaw drop to the ground at what an amazing tune this was and how much energy was just leaping out of the speakers. This is a song which has kind of transcended its chart performance and its place in this record and the band and so on. In that respect, it's a little bit similar to For What It's Worth by Buffalo Springfield for a different generation and different era. The rhythm section is super tight. Zach's performance is amazing. Morello's performance is brilliant. I don't know what effect he's using in his solo, but it's pretty cool. And then it's got that incredible climax and outro. It's possibly the perfect heavy song. So much so that you kind of have pity for the next song which comes along, but luckily that one rules also, and it's Take the Power Back. Here it's much more the Public Enemy side of the influence than it is the Black Sabbath side. Lyrically, this is about bullshit Eurocentric education. The rhythm section, again, is just amazing. The outro riff is just butter, and at this point you're thinking this is a perfect record. Settle for Nothing is next. This is basically a song about the prison system and some necessary frank talk about how really all it is a place to house those who have been failed by other systems. Side one concludes with Bullet in the Head, which has a great bass intro, which is kind of a throwback to all those punk tunes in the late 70s and early 80s that would lead in with the bass. Musically, this is more in the Public Enemy side of the ledger, but the breakdown and the bridge are pure Sabbath in terms of their construction and their intent. Side 2 starts with Know Your Enemy, which has kind of a Talking Headsy vibe at first. Then it seems to morph into 70s boogie rock, kind of like ZZ Top, or maybe if the James Gang were playing in Blade Runner. Killer riffs all the way through this song, and the rhythm section swings like a mother. The next song, Wake Up, has a kind of Kashmir vibe. It's got that droning kind of entry. More killer riffs. You've got some conspiracy stuff about the Malcolm X and the King assassinations. There's some black nationalism in here, and then we're back to that Kashmir type feel. Next song is Fistful of Steel. I mentioned their influences before. I should probably also have mentioned Gang of Four. Rage similarly has that kind of punk, funk, heavy guitar fusion. This is the first place where I think they kind of falter. This song kind of meanders. It's not quite at the level of these other tracks. And that feeling continues in the next song, Township Rebellion. I'm starting to feel this is now kind of standard issue. They redeem themselves a little bit though on the very last track of the album, Freedom, which has a great riff on the bridge in particular with these harmonic overdubs. There's better variety in terms of the different sounds in the song, and there's this great climbing bass line at the end, and then we're out. These guys carve out a lane between heavy metal and rap, which always has the potential to be a little bit cheesy or lack authenticity. They make it work because these guys have both the musical chops and the radical credentials. It's not a perfect record. There's a couple places on side two where the writing kind of breaks down and becomes a little bit formulaic, like, you know, I've been here before, I've seen this movie before. But overall, the energy and the vitality and the musicianship and just the overall vim of this record is overwhelming. It's a groundbreaking piece of art. For me, it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.